Hello everyone, this is Tatiana. Welcome to today's Intro to Environmental Science lecture on invasive species. Today we're going to be talking about hippopotamus amphibians in the water bodies of Colombia. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the hippos, how were they invasively introduced, the action that has been done to mitigate this, and the sources of information for this. So first, let's talk about hippos. Hippos are commonly referred to as either the common hippopotamus or the river hippopotamus, and their scientific name is Hippopotamus amphibius. Hippos are animals that are very familiar to most of us. Some of their main physical characteristics include they have a large head, they have a big and thick body, they are dark grayish brown in color. Their mouths can be up to 50 centimeters wide, and they have up to 30 centimeter large teeth. They can expand their mouths a lot. They have 4 legs, 4 toes, and hooves on each leg. Their tails are usually short, and they exhibit sexual dimorphisms, which means that males tend to be larger than females, and males tend to weigh up to 3.5 tons. They are in fact considered the second largest terrestrial animal on Earth. In their native environment, hippos usually inhabit shallow and warm freshwater bodies such as rivers, ponds, lakes, and this is where they partly submerge to rest and sleep. They also spend a lot of time in grassland that are located near the water bodies, and they visit them at night for grazing and feeding. And finally, they look for muddy areas during droughts to keep their sensitive skin moist and protected from the sun. Okay, now hippos' native distribution usually ranges across most of the sub-Saharan Africa area, which is the green highlighted area on the map, and they play very important key roles in this native ecosystem. For instance, their digestion and defecation deposit nutrients, minerals, and microorganisms into the water bodies when they graze on the grasslands and then poop in the water. They are an important transfer. This benefits the fish, the plants, and other organisms in the water. And of course, this also benefits humans and other predators that rely on fish and the other organisms. They also heavily impact the area's geology and vegetation dynamics, as their grazing causes erosion and movement in the earth. They also create trenches and other geological features as they repetitively walk the same paths when they feed in land. These structures are important because they permit and change the flow circulation of water along the area. Let's now talk about hippos' feeding, movement, mating behaviors. For starters, for feeding, they are strictly herbivores. Their diet consists mainly of grass, but they occasionally feed on leaved or aquatic plants. In regards to movement, during the day, they use their slight buoyancy to raft and cruise throughout the water. They technically can't swim or float, so they tend to stay in shallow waters where they can use their short legs to push their body upwards and front leg to move. During nighttime, they tend to exit the water and occupy nearby grasslands where they walk a few kilometers to feed. And now in regards to mating, it usually takes place in the water. This species is considered a case strategist, mainly because they invest a lot of time and energy in producing high-quality offspring. The females tend to be highly protective and territorial with newborn calves for a few weeks after birth, which can cause aggression and danger to approaching humans or other organisms. And finally, they also exhibit seasonality. Rainy seasons are favored and produce more abundant and successful births. Let's now talk about how was the species introduced into Colombia and how did it become, or why is it considered invasive. This is a brief timeline of how were hippos introduced into Colombia. In 1981, the criminal Pablo Escobar imported wild animals, including 4 hippos, to be kept in his rural property in the Antioquia department. In 1993, Escobar dies, and thus all animals were allocated from his property into zoos and other establishments. But this wasn't done with the hippos. These were left there because they were very expensive and difficult to transport. So they were basically left to live and reproduce uncontrolled in a set of ponds, streams, and rivers across the region. So currently there are as much as 130 hippos spread throughout the area. Some of these have been found as far as 170 kilometers away from their original location. The fact that hippos have been so successful in reproducing and spreading throughout the area has certainly caused an impact on native species since they were introduced. So hippos are very particular in the fact that they possess no direct predatory threat to the native species, but more to the area's geological, morphology, biology, and hydrology that then impacts the fauna and the flora in the area. The problem is that their heavy bodies compress and modify the shape of soft-bottom rivers and ponds. That causes alterations in water movement and drainage in the area. They also transfer nutrients and compounds from the areas that they graze to the water through feces, and this is really problematic because this excess nutrients cause algal blooms, and along with their modification of the geological patterns, they create pools of water without oxygen that are basically depleted or of any other life form other than algal blooms. This is also a problem because organisms in the water may not be adapted to these new nutrient-rich conditions that the hippos are causing. Now, hippos in the water are taking over the habitat of the river manatee that cruises throughout these rivers and ponds, and on the grassland, they are outcompeting other grazing herbivores such as capybaras. This is a very interesting image presented in the Science magazine. In an article where hippos are referred to as the nutrient kingpins or the ecosystem engineers of their African waterways. So now we may wonder, if they're so important and so good for the African environment, why are they being harmful as an invasive species in the Colombia environment? Well, the thing is, the African environment has a set of specific characteristics, organisms, and systems that allow the hippos to exist, mate, and feed in these areas without causing an imbalance. As we can see in the diagram, the African waterways have a set of organisms that can take advantage of the nutrients deposited by hippos into the water. These nutrients can be upcycled and used throughout the food chain, and thus there won't be an imbalance in the environment. So the main problem in Colombia is that these sets of organisms are not present, and thus there's no way to counteract the nutrient input and the geological features created by hippos. We will now talk about the action that has to be done or is being done to take care of hippos as an invasive species in Colombia. There is currently a lot of uncertainty on the best method to control the hippo population in Colombia, mainly because the species was just declared invasive in 2022, so its plan of control is certainly in development and in its first stages. So there's 3 specific strategies that were considered as viable for the elimination of the species from the introduced environment. For starters, sterilization. The problem with this is that there are too many hippos and sterilization is too costly and slow to be effective, especially with their exponential growth and rapid population growth rate. Another option is killing the hippos, but this was considered cruel and thus ruled out by the community, and especially because hippos have become an emblem and a symbol of the community around them. Finally, relocation has been considered as the most viable option. It consists of moving these hippos to zoos around the country and around the world. There's some limitations, of course, and it's that this is expensive and the funds are limited, but it's still considered the best and probably the option that will be carried away. Having considered all these options, the Colombian environmental authorities established an elimination plan, mainly based on relocation. So 70 of the hippos are going to be transported to wildlife sanctuaries and zoos in India and Mexico. For this, the individuals are going to be gathered in the original location and then are going to be organized in large cages. The problem is that permits needed for this are still being processed, and they need to be issued by the competent authorities. Good news is that Botswana, Ecuador, and the Philippines have also expressed interest in receiving some of these individuals. And as it was mentioned, this is certainly considered an environmental friendly option since the hippos are not killed and at the same time the habitat is being restored. We can question now whether this species is great enough threat to prompt immediate action to be removed, and I personally believe that yes, it is. Individually, the effects of hippos in the ecosystem may not be as remarkable, but since now the size of the population is considerably large, they're causing a large collective negative threat to it. So the minimal individual effects are being maximized into a very large collective detrimental threat. Also, the traditional population in Africa is usually kept in balance by competition, diseases, and drought, elements that do not naturally take place in the Colombia environment. Studies have been done, and it has been shown that if nothing is done, the population will reach 1,420 individuals by 2039, when the ecosystem reaches carrying capacity, which is not a good sign since this means that most of the river systems would already be affected by the hippos and the resources would be almost depleted. There's also potential economical benefit of taking action in protecting the fish and the population that depends on them, while also preventing deadly attacks to humans in the area. So thank you so much for attending this lecture. This is all for today. In the following slides, you can see the references and the sources used for the presentation's images and information.